Tokenization. There's been a lot of different talk, a lot of questions that we've seen. A lot of people seem to be confused on, or not very clear on what tokenization really means, what it is. It's a new term. There's some people are arguing that all tokens are securities, or all tokens are not securities. And so I figured we'd talk a little bit about, like, what does tokenization mean? What does it mean to tokenize something? I mean, from a technology standpoint, you look at tokens, they're just ledger entries, right? They're just digital representations of something.
Mm-hmm.
What does tokenization mean to you guys, for example, when tokenizing, let's say tokenizing an asset like a piece of real estate? What's your take on that?
Yeah, just like what you said, you're creating a digital representation of a particular asset that can be traded and exchanged without having to hand over the actual hard asset. It represents an ownership interest in that particular item, either tangible or intangible. But nevertheless, it's just a digital representation of that particular asset.
So what if I were to tokenize my house, for example, I could go out and download an open source copy of a cryptocurrency and say, okay, I've created 1,000 tokens. Each one is 1/10 of 1% of the ownership of my house. Is that all I need to do, or what are the extra steps to really kind of make it something useful?
Yeah, well, that's all well and good, but we have an old legacy system that we currently have to live in, so to speak. So if you're dealing in real estate, there are things you would normally have to do to at least confirm the ownership and the value of that property, any liens or encumbrances. So you're going to have to do what you would normally do, the typical due diligence to research the property through the current land records, confirm who owns the property, whether or not taxes have been paid, whether or not there are any liens or judgments against the property. You're going to have to get an appraisal done to confirm the value of the property. If there's insurance on the property, it's just the normal, typical things you would normally do when you're going to decide to purchase real property. If you're going to create a digital representation of it, you're going to want to all that would essentially be all the qualities of the property would have to be encoded on that digital representation in some form. If someone's going to look at that and say, okay, I will now either accept that or not accept it, or there would still have to be certain things you'd have to do to clean up the title if they were going to want to acquire a percentage ownership or all of the ownership rights in that particular digital asset that you're creating.
So it's fair to say I can create the tokens anytime I want, but there's a extra work to be done to tie those tokens to an actual legally enforceable ownership mechanism, right? Does that make sense? So tokenizing an asset is more than just creating the coins, but you have to actually then create a mechanism in which you can legally enforce. Me owning a coin means me owning a certain percentage of the asset it represents, right? Is that what needs to happen?
No, absolutely. And right now, the blockchain and cryptocurrency space is so new. I mean, and all the legal and regulatory issues haven't really been hashed out or clarified. So this is all kind of speculation. We're still having to live in this old world technology where we have to do all the underlying due diligence to confirm all these other things that I talked about. But then you can now create a digital representation that represents all those attributes of a specific property. And then at that point, what do you do with it? That's the next thing. So you have this digital representation of the property with all its aspects and qualities, and now what can you do with it? What's the next step? I think that's the question.
Andrew, what is the definition of tokenization?
So, the official definition in the dictionary would be to serve as an indication, proof of something else, kind of like it's a token of my affection, or the crown jewels tokenize the authority of the crown, right? And I think that has some validity in terms of the tokens themselves. The asset tokens, when you create them, represent something. In our case, for example, the ownership interests of equity in the asset. So they're just a simple representation of something else, and that's where a lot of the confusion, I think, stems from. People say, well, is it a security? Is it not a security? Well, if the token represents a security, then it's a security, right? If it represents something that's not a security, a commodity, for example, then it's a commodity. So
right.
So that's lost on I think all of the media hype and things that are happening right now, is that tokenization is just a link, right? And
yeah, exactly. And when we bring in, for instance, tokenization as it relates to cryptocurrency, people talk about the Howey test, and the Howey test is all about what future value can be made or used, how this cryptocurrency can be used with future value, and is there future value in this cryptocurrency, for instance, as a real as something that's different than traditional currency, for instance.
Well, and that's in the context of capital raising. I mean, that's when you look at the Howey test. Well, you're looking at it. You're not going out and trying to crowdfund your startup. What you're doing is you're going out to individual property owners and say, hey, would you like to realize the equity in your home? We can create a digital representation of that ownership interest that we can that you can be exchanged for cryptocurrency, so you can realize the true equity in your home, the liquidity in your home, without having to go through the traditional means to do it, and having to literally give them everything and the kitchen sink, your firstborn child to get a home loan. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but still, I mean, it's literally still a very arcane process. People are you still need hand holding to go through it. Doing a completely online mortgage is still listen. It's still, people are talking about doing that, but it hasn't become a realization as of yet.
No,
there's still a lot of paperwork involved. You still have to sit down with advisors. You still have to sit down and get things explained to you. But the simple way to get access to the liquidity in your equity by means of tokenizing it, like you're proposing, is revolutionary. Borrowing money from yourself, that's and not having to worry about not paying it back, and you not having a home to live in. I mean, that's obviously an idealistic thing, but it's true. I mean, you don't want to lose your home. It's where you want to spend the rest of your life, and if you can realize the liquidity.
Not my home, not this one. It's a little too cold. We got winter here, but yeah.
Well, you know what I mean. Yeah, realizing the liquidity without the fear of not being able to pay it back, and ultimately losing your home.
Yeah, well, I would almost argue that in today's terms, your deed is a token. It's a tokenizer. You're tokenizing the homes almost today already. It's just the deed is an indivisible single token, represents the entire ownership interest of your entire house.
Good point. It's
just an offline token. What the blockchain allows is you to divide that into multiple pieces that have different rights, that have smart behavior, that can have coded, predictable behavior. And then you can go use those in support of transactions. So, rather than sitting there and selling liquidity, you can get liquidity out of your house anytime you want. You just got to go sell your whole house, right? Or you have to go borrow it for that fee. But
yeah, exactly. Imagine paying for your coffee by conveying a portion of your house.
Yeah. I mean, if I went off and I just chipped off a couple bricks off the my house and took them into Starbucks, they kind of look at it. But and yet, if I take a few dollars over there that are little pieces of paper that aren't backed by anything anymore, then they'll give me the coffee for it. So it's the tokenization of being able to turn that deed into something visible and then eventually into something fungible that's equal and uniform across all the different
Right.
right.
Oh, absolutely.
But that's where we're headed. Yeah, yeah. So let's take that for an example. The financing aspect of tokenization. So today, if I own a piece of property, a condo, and I take it to you, Scott, to sell it, or I either have to sell it or I have to get some kind of a traditional loan against it, right, in order to access the equity. So what is tokenization open? What does that change? What am I doing to raise funds, for example?
Yes, so that's the beauty. I mean, there really is the next evolution in the funding mechanism that the blockchain allows, the tokenization of assets on a blockchain allows us to do. It really opens up those funding mechanisms and allows us to have a larger pool of potential funding sources. Basically, what you're doing in tokenizing, you're deciding to cut up your house ownership into divisible records. And so to cut that up in divisible records, I can cut that up into 2 records where I tokenize my house and I have me as an owner and I want to sell the other half to somebody else. All right, so now I've tokenized 100% of the house into 2 equal 50% ownership portions.
Well, you can do that now. You can do that now, can you not? I mean, you can draft a deed and sell fractional shares in your shares of interest in your property and record the deed. Obviously work through all the legalities of doing that, and the grantees in that deed now own a percentage interest in your property, and that gets recorded at the land records, and it's all well and good. So what's the benefit of tokenizing? And then once you have this digital representation, then what do you do with it? Is there an exchange that you go on that you can sell those interests, or then what are you going to do next? I think that leads into what Turbadium is doing as far as creating a digital currency that represents that asset that's tied to that asset by way of that tokenized that asset token, correct?
Yeah, so and without getting into the specifics of our model just yet and turning it into a fungible currency, I think tokenization, from a technical perspective, I think the benefits of tokenizing versus the traditional mechanism you mentioned, like changing the deed or placing the title into a trust, for example, that requires all kinds of paperwork and requires filing, whether it's amendments to the deed or doing title searches. I think from a technical perspective, if you've tokenized it, in which you've now created a pool of digital tokens that represent the ownership, you can now start transferring those tokens between parties in support of transactions without having to go through all that paperwork. Right? So there obviously has to be a setup to have that pool of tokens represent ownership of the asset in a legally binding manner. There has to be some setup ahead of time. And now, in our case, we use a smart trust, right? So we use a title holding trust, or we use a trust vehicle. But you could technically use an LLC and securitize the asset. But at the end of the day, I think the core concept of tokenization means there has to be a digital token somewhere on a blockchain that represents legally enforceable ownership interests in the tokenized asset, right?
Well, yeah, and here's the thing too about tokenizing real property assets. So you create a digital representation that you can then assign or convey in fractionalized interests, and you can do it via this immutable ledger of the blockchain that's completely auditable and transparent. But then again, you have to build that bridge, and that for one thing, and then you still have the land record systems that continually need to be maintained and reviewed, because you can have somebody decide that they're going to tokenize their asset, put it onto a blockchain, but then they still have this land record system that nothing gets recorded on. But what happens if they say, yeah, I don't care. I don't care what's happening with, with my tokenized asset on this secondary exchange. I'm going to go in and I'm going to borrow against the interest of my property. Nobody knows it exists on a blockchain. Nobody knows it's getting or if people do, nobody's looking at the land record systems anymore. They can go and get some hard money loan or go through a lender, because nobody's going to check a blockchain. They can borrow money against it, and then you have now it devalues that asset token, because then that wasn't necessarily placed onto that asset token or coded into that asset token to begin with, that particular lien or mortgage. Then what happens? So you have these two competing systems, and that's what I think you need to sufficiently encumber the land records to such an extent where you don't get that unscrupulous actor doing those things. And I think the land trust mechanism is good, because you can have an independent third-party trustee make sure that these things don't happen, and make sure that continuous due diligence takes place from the title perspective, to continue to look at those land registry systems that confirms no liens or judgments are getting recorded against the property, and it's still in that state that it was, once you pulled it off of the land records, tokenized it, and then placed it onto a blockchain.
So let me get this straight. So what you're talking about then is, let's say, for example, I turn my house into a pile of tokens, and I sell you 40% of my house in the form of these tokens. Now I go to a bank and I get a loan against my house for 100% of the value or 80% of the value. Now there's a lien against it. So what you're talking about is I guess the mechanism in which you protect the tokenization, so that the other parties are aware of it, right? So I can't go and double, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you're double dipping. You're still using the old land registry systems as a means to defraud these token holders, downstream token holders that own that digital 40%. And then now their interest is subject to a lien that you just took out that they didn't know about. So I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can. So I think making sure that once you've tokenized this property, at the time that you're doing it, that there's a mechanism in place that continues to review the land record systems to make sure nothing is getting done to lien the property that's going to affect any downstream owners, token holders in the future.
And then in our case, for example, in Turbadium's case, once we place it in the trust, that pretty much locks it in the hands of the fiduciary or the trustee, correct? So
yes.
They have typically it's an independent third party like a law firm, and they're going to make sure that the owner doesn't go off and get a lien against portions that they've already sold or deposited to generate currency. So I think so let's walk through maybe the steps of tokenization that might help just to visualize it a little bit. So if I've got an asset, a deedable, titleable asset like a condo building, and I wanted to tokenize it, the first thing I would do would it sounds like would be to place that asset into some form of a container, like a trust, or would I securitize it? Would I go through a Reg A? Would I put it in an LLC? Are these all options? So how do I actually turn that into a bunch of asset tokens?
Yeah, and it's exactly how you mentioned it. You have to determine how you're going to, what sort of legal vehicle you're going to use to apportion those interests. Are you going to create a trust instrument whereby title is held, legal title is held by the trustee, and the beneficial interest holder can then assign out his or her various interests in the property? In most jurisdictions, from what I understand, the legal classification would be one of personal property that they're assigning, or are you going to create an entity, a legal entity like an LLC or corporation, and then sell shares of stock?
So it sounds like it sounds like to me like whether or not a token is a security is possibly even determined really far upstream before you even get to the cryptocurrency part of how you set up the tokenization itself too, right? So if to expand on what you said, if you place it into a trust, now it's personal property, beneficial interest. That's like owning a ring, or that's like owning a piece of personal property, is it not, when it comes to the law? So
right.
In those cases,
that's correct.
So if we were to extrapolate that, I mean, right now the only way to access a lot of that capital is through traditional financial products, right? Loans, REITs, and different securitized investment vehicles. So will tokenization will that allow you to release a lot of that equity that's kind of locked up in that market and create any kind of economic effects, do you think?
Yeah, in my view and in our corporate view, we believe yes. It's no doubt that the way that banks in the current financial system, the way that individuals have to borrow funds for real estate or for make the world of real estate work for themselves, whether it's living in the house they own, whether it's having percent ownership in a coffee shop down the street that I own, for instance, as my business. The financing structure is so small and so privatized today that there's so many regulations, so much, gosh, there's just so many hoops you got to jump through to be able to have the right to force me to write a check to my bank to receive now a larger check back. That all it is my equity being given back to me to allow it to use. So it's
well, how much of that property is already encumbered by an existing lien?
In the county,
I mean, there's not much property out there, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, well, in our county, that's 18%. In the California alone, it's about 20% that are free and clear, unencumbered, zero debt. And in San Francisco County, it's about 17 to 18%. But you really, when you look at the overall value and the encumbrance, the actual encumbrances for the majority of individual asset owners are very tiny. They probably have 20, 30, 40% of their asset encumbered at most, and that's the majority of individuals. There's very few that have 60, 80, 90%
equity.
Yeah, exactly.
So around 70, 80% equity. Nice. And that they can't even realize because most of them can't get a second lien.
Well,
that's we'd have to go through the process of refinancing again.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because if you think about the economic effects of that, the less it's encumbered, the more of it's the free and clear of any loan, the more that equity is sitting there dead and being, just completely tied up, locked up in an illiquid asset. So it's almost like the less you have of loans, the less of a capital supply you have. And if you want to activate that by having to go and get a traditional loan and add to your property, now you're paying an annual fee and interest, right, of 4%, 7%, 8%. For it's kind of like a fee of using your own cash. So tokenization sounds like
exactly. And then and then what happens if you don't pay?
Yeah. Then you lose.
What happens if you don't pay your loan? Yeah, exactly. So in this case, with what we're proposing here, you don't have a means to ultimately lose ownership to your property if you're not paying on your loan.
So if you tokenize your house, basically you're selling off a little piece of it. You're at least with a trust vehicle, the way we do it, you're not selling off any kind of possessory or usury rights. Nobody can come in and use that 1% of your house. They're just basically buying a piece of the equity in your house. So with this type of vehicle, what you're not really loaning anything. You're just selling off little pieces or percentages. So you kind of get rid of foreclosures completely, right?
That you can buy back. That you can buy back, but you don't lose it. You don't lose the right to use 100% of your property. you just parted with a portion of it in exchange for liquidity.
So going back to that, kind of like the way we used to do money in the U.S., with it being backed by, say, gold and silver. Each dollar represented an ounce or a certain percentage of silver on deposit somewhere. You can go in and trade it in. Is that similar to what we're doing here, except now rather than having it being gold and silver on deposit, now you're talking about real estate pieces of the actual ownership of a house backing the money?
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yep.
similar, definitely similarities, and obviously the difference being too, what happens if you're passing out these notes that represent an ounce of gold, but that ounce of gold isn't really sitting in your vault.
Right.
In this case, with real estate, it's there. You can go see it. You can walk right up to it and know it's there. It's not movable.
And you can look up the records and make sure that
absolutely
the information is securely backed to the tokens themselves too, right? So you can go audit and make sure it's not just, oh, I say this is backed by my house, but it isn't really, right? Because that's all a matter of public record.
Right. Yeah, I think creating a digital representation of that asset or percentage of that asset, and then apportioning it off using a blockchain-based exchange or system is a huge benefit. Like I said, doing it in the mechanism that we're proposing, and not going through a REIT model, i.e., a land trust that's like I said, separate from that model. You can really use the power of the crowd to allow for the investment and transfer of these fractionalized interests on these tokenized assets. So I think, and you can do it immediately and completely auditable and transparent within that ecosystem, and it creates so much benefit. I mean, there are many ways to play this tokenized asset model. I mean, either through the apportionment of the shares of ownership in that asset, or through the creation of a fungible currency by locking up the asset and tying it to that real estate.
So let me ask you this, Scott. So in the example where you've got a couple of rental properties and they're bringing in $3,500 a month in rent. If you wanted to go out and buy another property today, your only real option is to go get a loan against your existing properties, right? Pay bank interest and make payments. But if you were to tokenize those, you could sell off, say, 30-40% of each of those buildings and raise enough money to go buy another one, just from selling out the interest. Now, does that change anything in terms of how you get your rent from those existing buildings, or what kind of impact does that have on your rental business?
Yeah, that's the beauty, I believe, of tokenization. One of the many positive impacts. So, for instance, let's take a 4-unit apartment complex here in San Francisco that is owned by a single entity, and now you want to this family wants to be able to do something more with that asset, but the money is locked. There's locked money within that asset. So, $2 million fourplex here in San Francisco. How can I get my hands on that $2 million that makes up the worth of that asset, and what now can I do with that $2 million? So today I have single relationship. I have to call up my favorite or maybe least favorite banker and say, hey, I want to borrow $250,000 of my $2 million within my asset. What does it take for me to do that? And they're going to give me a whole bunch of paperwork to sign, and at the end, I'm going to have to give them a check. I'm going to have to give them a check just for them to give me a check. That's how it works. I have to pay them first. So today's model,
borrowing your own money, are you not?
There you go. And so in today's model, the asset owner has to pay up front for the ability and for the rights to borrow your own money. And the beauty of tokenization, now let's take that $2 million fourplex here in San Francisco. I want to sell off just a small percentage. I want to gain 250K back. I'm going to be able to tokenize a small percentage of that and stick that tokenized value that represents that $2 million fourplex onto the platform. And now I can have individuals that want to buy into my particular asset and have a belief that this asset is worth something and that token is worth something. And therefore, I'm really allowed to have a new way of potentially funding using those funds. That $250,000 that I can gain from tokenizing that asset, that individual, for instance, that buys that $250,000 of that value, they don't have rights to the rent that I get, for instance. So they don't have income rights. On the reverse, they don't have debt rights. So for instance, if I have a water bill, an electric bill, and other things that make cost to run that apartment building, they don't have the debt obligations, for instance. So it's simply a straight transfer of value for the asset into a tokenized fashion. And then we're given...
No, sorry, no, so is that a function, for example, the person not having rights to share the income, or if they buy 25% of your building in the form of tokens, they don't have, they're not on the hook for costs, but they're also not sharing in the profits. Is that a function of tokenization, or is that a function of how the tokens are set up? Are there tokens that allow for the sharing of income, for example?
Yes, there's definitely tokens that would allow for the sharing of income. Certainly, I mean, that's the beauty of the blockchain. Smart contracts, information can be written into the contracts of whatever either sides believe they want to have happen within that tokenization framework. So certainly the method to have liability rights transferred and have all people that own parts of the token have liability, as well as have access to that income. You can certainly have the tokenization framework written in that regard. That would be not be a problem at all. But I think the main initial way to do it is really how we're doing it, which is simply tokenizing the asset and not allowing the rights of that asset to be transferred, such as in a traditional sense. If I was bringing in a private partner to buy a portion of my asset, for instance.
Right, because those tokens are getting essentially locked up in some sort of vault mechanism via smart contract, and cryptocurrency tokens are being dispensed to the asset owner in the equivalent value of the asset token, correct?
So that's in our system, for example. Yes. So we take those asset tokens and we deposit them to generate a fungible cryptocurrency, a general purpose one, which I think we can get into in a future episode, because I guess you could say that's one of the drawbacks of straight tokenizing a real estate asset. Is at the end of the day, what are you left with except a pile of coins? They're digital coins, but they're easily transferable, but they're just coins that represent ownership of, say, for example, my house or the asset that I tokenized. I would still have to go find somebody that wants to own a piece of that, right? So tokenizing, to me, it sounds like is just a vehicle to turn ownership records or to turn legally binding ownership of an asset into these digital tokens. Once you have that, I think there's other steps that may be taken to make them more useful. But all the confusion over is a token a security? Is a token? I mean, I could certainly probably tokenize anything. I could tokenize intellectual property rights. I could tokenize a trademark. I could I could tokenize the amount of breaths I take every day, right?
Right.
Right. But what those represent, what those tokens represent, are probably what would determine whether or not they're security.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it's to your and Scott's point. You can write the rules into the smart contract, and they will represent what you code into it. So if you code into it ownership rights, and then in the next instance, code in that it's a currency. It's a little bit different than, because in the securities offering space, in these ICO spaces, what they're marketing and what they're offering, in some instances, clearly may be securities. So it's fact dependent. So you have to look at each case differently and assess whether or not it's a security under the Howey test. And in this situation, what we are proposing, it doesn't necessarily, from my perspective, meet the Howey test.
And for an asset token, then it sounds like there aren't any of these counterparties involved. It just I've got a token and I send it to Scott, and now he has the token. So is that pretty much the way it works?
Yeah, I mean, like you said before, you create a digital representation of that asset that you can fractionalize however you want. And if you like I said, if your interface says, I'm going to send you, 0.5% of my 40% interest, you now own 0.5% of my 40% interest.
Scott, for a question for you, since you talked about all these buying real estate, you have to have social security numbers and green cards. So does that mean somebody in China can go pick up asset tokens that represent ownership of say, a U.S. property, and without any of these requirements?
No. No, they can't. It's not that simple, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right. So we have laws, and know your customer regulations, and anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism, OFAC. So we've got all these laws that.
We just talked about tokens. So these are digital representations. What's to stop me from sending a token to somebody in China?
I can answer that. Really, nothing.
Yeah, no.
Other than you create a protocol that says we don't sell to this jurisdiction, but then again, there's always ways around that. There's exchanges. There's unregulated exchanges out there that sell these things as well. So it's very difficult to police. Very difficult to police.
Would the question be, though, if that person in China now had that token, is that enforceable? Would they be able to actually cash in or demand their 1% of the house when let's say you sold it?
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, you're looking at it's jurisdictionally based now. But then again, you can always write arbitration rules into these smart contracts at the outset to say if there's an issue, this jurisdiction will apply. And then this jurisdiction is going to look at contract law to see if the transaction was a legally enforceable one anyway. So you're going to still have court systems to have to adjudicate these things, but you can write into the terms of the agreement who has jurisdiction, who has the authority to arbitrate the dispute, and then who has the authority to enforce it, which jurisdiction has the authority to enforce it at that point. So you can write all these rules into the smart contract at the outset.
Okay. Oh, and you can see where I'm going with all this, obviously, is leading into our next episode, which will be about how we tackle all these challenges and turn those asset tokens into a general use cryptocurrency. But in the meantime, though, it sounds like the technology allows a lot of things to happen, but the primary challenge of tokenization to me sounds like getting the off blockchain world to follow the same rules that you have on the chain, right? So that if I send somebody a token, I'm sending them legally binding ownership rights of that asset, right? And if I send it across borders that don't exist on the blockchain, that whatever tokenization vehicle you use to tokenize the asset has to carry across those jurisdictional boundaries, because if they don't, you're basically losing the tokenization when you send it over across borders. So So it sounds like tokenization is just a mix of at the end. There's some technology involved, but the technology is just a fancy way of recording the ledger entries, and getting the legal side of things to meet that and follow that is where the challenge sounds like to me today.
That's exactly right.
Yes. Yes.